For 14 months, Dorothy walked past that key every single day. Small and brass, hanging on its nail behind the kitchen door, right next to the dish towel. She passed it in the morning reaching for her coffee. She passed it at night turning off the light. And every single time, she looked away. The shed at the back of the yard had been Frank's, locked for as long as she could remember. For over 20 years, he'd gone out there after dinner, sometimes for an hour, sometimes until she was already asleep. And she had never once asked what he was doing. That was their marriage. She had her sewing room, he had his shed. Some things are private not because of secrets, but because of love. Then Frank died, and Dorothy couldn't bring herself to use the key. Not grief exactly, something more like respect for a door she'd spent 40 years not opening. That was before her daughter arrived with a realtor, before the phrases like comparable properties and your options at this stage started filling the rooms she'd built her life in. Before her daughter stood in the backyard, looked at that padlock and said the words Dorothy hadn't been prepared for. "Mom, don't you think it's time we found out what's in there?" What was in there? As if Frank's shed were an inconvenience to be cleared out. As if 40 years of quiet evenings and a key on a nail were just things that needed sorting before the house could be sold. Dorothy was 67 years old, a widow. A woman people worried about, pitied gently, brought casseroles to. And she had one decision left to make. She could let her daughter open that door, or she could open it herself. What she found inside would not just answer the question of what Frank had been doing all those years. It would answer something far larger. Something about the kind of love that never announces itself. The kind that works quietly, in the evenings, with its ends, for decades, and leaves everything it built waiting for exactly the right moment. Stay with me, because what was behind that locked door will break your heart wide open. You're here for a reason. Together, we'll reveal what someone tried to hide. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and comment wherever you're watching. The neighbors still brought casseroles sometimes. Dorothy had learned to accept them gracefully, to say thank you and mean it, to set them on the kitchen counter and eat a small portion before storing the rest in containers she never quite got around to finishing. It had been 14 months since Frank died. People were kind. They just didn't know what else to do with a 67-year-old woman living alone in a 3-bedroom house on Clover Mill Road, and if she was honest, neither did she. The house was too big for one person. She knew that. Frank had known it too, toward the end. She'd caught him measuring the garden fence once, quietly, with that particular look he got when he was working something through in his mind. He hadn't said anything, and she hadn't asked. They'd had 40 years of that kind of understanding. The kind where you didn't need to name every thought out loud because the other person was already following the thread. Now there was no one to follow the thread. Dorothy moved through the house the way she'd moved through the months since the funeral. Carefully, deliberately, touching things she didn't need to touch. The kitchen table where Frank had sat every morning with his coffee and the crossword. The hook by the back door where his coat had hung until she finally, quietly, moved it to the closet in February. The window above the sink that looked out over the backyard. The vegetable beds Frank had built her out of cedar planks. And at the far end of the property, just visible through the old apple tree, the shed. She didn't look at the shed directly, as a rule. It wasn't grief exactly, or not only grief. It was something more like respect. Frank had kept that shed locked for as long as she could remember. 20, 25 years at least. He went out there in the evenings after dinner, sometimes for an hour, sometimes until she'd already gone to bed. She'd hear the light through the bedroom curtains, that faint, warm glow from the single bulb above the workbench, and she'd fall asleep to the distant sound of him moving around in there, doing whatever it was he did. She had never asked. It was his. That was how they worked. She had her sewing room, he had his shed. Some things were private, not because of secrets, but because of selfhood. Because even inside a good marriage, a person needs a room of their own. The key hung on a small nail behind the kitchen door, on a ring by itself. Plain brass, slightly worn at the bow. She passed it every time she reached for the dish towel. Diane called on a Thursday. Dorothy heard her daughter's voice and felt a particular mixture of warmth and low-grade tension that Diane had always produced in her, even as a child. Diane was 41 now, efficient and capable in the way that made Dorothy both proud and slightly exhausted. She lived 3 hours away in Hartford, had a husband, 2 teenagers, a demanding job in hospital administration. She called twice a week, always with a list. "Mom, I've been thinking." That was how Diane started most of her calls lately. "I've been thinking about the house." "The house is fine," Dorothy said. "I know it's fine, but it's a lot to maintain. The roof alone. You said yourself the inspector mentioned the north section." Diane's voice was careful, measured, the way it got when she'd already decided something and was building the argument. "I talked to Greg, and we think maybe it's worth having someone come out, just to assess, just to know what you're working with, financially." "I know what I'm working with." "Mom," a small pause. "You're 67, you're alone, in a house that needs work. I'm not saying you have to do anything. I'm just saying it might be smart to understand your options." Dorothy looked out the window at the apple tree. The first leaves were coming in, pale and new. Frank had planted the tree the spring after Diane was born. "I'll think about it," she said. She wouldn't think about it, and Diane knew she wouldn't think about it. They'd had this conversation, in various forms, for the better part of a year. Diane arrived on a Saturday morning 3 weeks later with Greg's business card in her purse and a realtor named Curtis who drove a silver SUV and spoke entirely in phrases like comparable properties and current market conditions. She'd called ahead, which Dorothy appreciated. She'd also brought muffins, which Dorothy appreciated less because it felt like softening. They walked through the house together. Curtis made notes on his phone. Dorothy watched him catalog the rooms of her marriage, the creak in the third stair, the windows Frank had reglazed himself, the kitchen she'd repainted 4 times and finally got right. And she felt something cold and steady moving through her chest. Not anger, something more patient than anger. In the backyard, Curtis paused and looked toward the shed. "What's in there?" "That was my husband's." "Usable square footage, though. If it's structurally sound, that could be attractive to a buyer. Workshop space is a selling point." He made another note. Diane turned to Dorothy. Her expression was careful, soft in the way that was worse than directness. "Ma'am, you haven't been in there, have you? Since Dad?" "No." "Don't you think maybe you should? You don't even know what's in there. There could be tools worth selling, or things that need to be cleared out before..." She stopped. "Before anything. Before we sell the house." That was what she meant. Dorothy looked at the shed, the padlock dull in the spring light. The single window with Frank's old curtain drawn across it, a scrap of blue canvas she'd never seen from the inside. "I'll think about it," Dorothy said again. But that evening, after Curtis had driven away and Diane had hugged her too tightly and promised to call Tuesday, Dorothy stood in the kitchen with a dish towel in her hand and looked at the brass key on its nail. 14 months. She'd passed it 1,000 times. She'd never once reached for it. She thought about the way Diane had looked at the shed, the way Curtis had made his note. She thought about Frank's evenings out there, the light through the curtains. 20 years, maybe more, of nights when he'd finished his dinner and said, "I'm going out for a bit," in that quiet way of his, and she'd nodded, and he'd gone, and she'd never asked why, and he'd never explained, and it had felt like the most natural thing in the world. Because it was theirs. The whole marriage was theirs, including the parts they held separately. She put down the dish towel. She took the key off the nail. She didn't go out that night. She just held it. The brass was warm from the kitchen, lighter than she'd expected. She stood at the window and looked at the shed in the dark. at the small shape of it against the back fence with the apple tree's new shadow moving over the roof. And she thought, 40 years. She thought, he left me the house, he left me everything, and the shed is part of everything. And I have been standing here for 14 months, being afraid of a door. She put the key in her cardigan pocket. She went to bed. The next morning, Diane called at 8:30. Mom, I've been thinking. Curtis said if we want to lease before summer, we really should start getting the property cleared and assessed. The shed especially. Can I come next weekend? We can open it together. I can help you go through whatever's in there. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. I'll open it today, she said. By myself. Mom, I'll call you after. She hung up. She made her coffee. She drank it, standing at the kitchen window, watching the morning come into the yard the way Frank had watched it for 40 years. The light working its way across the cedar beds, the apple tree, the shed. Then she set down her mug, took the key from her cardigan pocket where she'd put it the night before, and somehow left it all through her sleep and walked to the back door. The padlock was stiffer than she expected. She worked the key twice before the mechanism gave, and the hasp swung free with a sound like something exhaling. Dorothy stood with her hand on the door and gave herself one moment, just one, before she pushed it open. The smell reached her first. Cedar shavings and linseed oil, and something underneath both of those. Something she recognized without being able to name, the way you recognize a person's smell after a long time apart. Frank. The shed smelled like Frank. She stepped inside. It took her eyes a moment to adjust. The single window let in grey morning light, and she found the pull cord for the bulb by feel. When the light came on, she made a sound she hadn't planned. Not a word, not quite a sob, something in between. The shed was full of furniture, not rough or unfinished, not the hobby project pieces of a man who'd taken up woodworking in his retirement. These were extraordinary. A rocking chair with arms curved like held hands, the grain of the wood following the shape so precisely it seemed to have grown that way. A writing desk, small and perfect, with dovetail joints so fine they looked stitched. A blanket chest with a carved panel on the front. She leaned closer and saw it was their house, unmistakably their house, with the apple tree in the yard and the curtained windows and a woman standing at the kitchen sink. She put her fingers against it and breathed. Shelves lined both walls. On them, smaller pieces. Boxes with fitted lids, their hinges invisible until you looked for them. A set of nested bowls turned from a single piece of maple. Picture frames. A cradle. She stopped at the cradle for a long moment, not understanding, and then understanding. It was child-sized, for a grandchild, finished and waiting. For Diane's children, or for some future she and Frank had imagined together without speaking of it directly. In the center of the shed, on the main workbench, his tools were laid out with the care of a man who intended to come back to them. He hadn't known. Or maybe he had. Frank had been sick for 8 months before the end, and for the last 3 of those months he hadn't been able to come out here. She'd watched him look at the shed sometimes from the kitchen window when he thought she wasn't watching him. On the corner of the workbench, beside a worn spokeshave and a jar of finish brushes, was a tin box, the kind that had once held English biscuits. The lid was dented at one corner. Her name was written on it in Frank's handwriting, in black marker. Dorothy. Just that, her name in his hand. She sat down on his work stool. She opened the box. Inside, rubber banded together, were envelopes. 40 of them. She counted without meaning to count. Each one dated, each one labeled in the same patient handwriting. Year 1. Year 5. Our 10th. The year Diane left for college. The year your mother died. The year I thought I was losing you and didn't know how to say so. She opened the first one. His voice came off the page so completely that she had to set it down and press her hands flat on the workbench and just breathe for a moment. Not his formal voice, not the voice he used for phone calls or doctor's appointments, his real voice. The one she heard at 11 o'clock at night when they lay in the dark and talked about nothing important for hours. She read for a long time. He had been writing to her since their first anniversary. 1 letter per year, sometimes more, when something moved him. He hadn't meant for her to read them while he was alive, that was clear. They were the things he didn't know how to say out loud to a woman he loved, in the way some men love, entirely and silently, convinced that showing the whole of it would be too much. So he'd written it down. He'd written it down and kept it in a tin box on the corner of his workbench for 40 years. And gone out to the shed in the evenings, not only to build things with his hands, but to be near the record of everything he felt. She was still reading when her phone rang. Diane. Dorothy let it ring. Then she put the phone face down on the workbench and kept reading. She read about the year she'd been ill, the fear he hadn't shown her because she needed him steady. She read about the argument they'd had in 1994, the bad one that had lasted 4 days, and his account of sitting in this shed on the third night, wondering how he'd been so stupid, and writing 7 pages about it that he'd been too proud to say to her face. She read the letter from the year Diane was born, the pure shock of it. Frank reduced to 3 pages of something barely coherent, circling the word miraculous, like he couldn't stop returning to it. She was on the letter from their 25th anniversary when Diane knocked on the shed door. "Mom," her voice was careful, "I drove up. You didn't call back and Can I come in?" Dorothy didn't answer immediately. "Come in," she said. Diane stepped into the shed and stopped. Dorothy watched her daughter's eyes move across the room. The rocking chair, the writing desk, the blanket chest, the shelves, and saw the exact moment Diane understood that she had not known her father the way she'd thought she knew him. "What is all this?" "He built it. All of it." Diane walked to the blanket chest, touched the carved panel the same way Dorothy had touched it. Her face was doing something complicated. "Mom, these are beautiful. These are really beautiful. Do you know if he ever sold any?" "Diane," Dorothy said it quietly, but her daughter stopped talking. "I found letters." She held up the tin box. Diane looked at it. "He wrote to me every year, since our first anniversary. I didn't know." Diane's expression shifted. The administrator's efficiency dropped away, and underneath it was just her daughter, 41 years old, standing in her dead father's shed. "What do they say?" 40 years of what he couldn't figure out how to tell me in person. Dorothy set the box carefully back on the workbench. Things he was afraid of, things he was grateful for, things he loved. She paused. Things he wanted me to know if he ever left me without warning. Diane was quiet. "He knew," Dorothy said. "Somewhere he knew he might not have time to say it all. So he wrote it down and kept it out here, where he could be near it." "Mom." "He left me the house, Diane." Her voice was steady, not angry, steadier than she'd felt in 14 months. "He left me all of it. The house, this shed, everything in it. He spent 40 years building me things I didn't know about, writing me letters I hadn't read yet, and living me a life that was already paid for before I knew I'd need it." She looked at her daughter directly. "I'm not selling." Diane opened her mouth and closed it again. Something crossed her face. The Realtor's phone number, the assessment, the conversations with Greg. And then it passed, and what was left was quieter. "I wasn't trying to push you out," Diane said. The words came slowly. "I was scared. You're alone here, and I'm 3 hours away, and I don't always know how to help you." "I know." Curtis said the market. I know what Curtis said. They stood in the shed in the smell of cedar and linseed oil, in the light of Frank's single bulb, surrounded by 40 years of his patient, unspoken devotion. "I need to finish reading the letters," Dorothy said. "I need to do that alone." Diane nodded. She looked around the shed once more, the rocking chair, the cradle waiting on its shelf, and pressed her lips together. Then she walked over and put her arms around her mother without saying anything, and Dorothy held her for a moment, her daughter who was afraid for her, her daughter who had driven 3 hours because Dorothy hadn't called back, her daughter who didn't always know the difference between helping and pushing. "Go put the kettle on," Dorothy said. "I'll come in when I'm finished." She read until noon. The last letter was undated. It was also the longest, 11 pages in Frank's careful hand, the writing smaller than usual, as if he had been trying to fit everything remaining into whatever space was left. She knew from the paper, slightly different from the others, and from the way the ink had bled at certain words, that he had written it during the final months, when he still had the strength, but not always the steadiness. He began by telling her he was sorry for every evening he'd come out here instead of staying in the room with her. He said he'd tried to explain it to himself, and the best he could manage was this: that the shed was where he put the feelings that were too large to live inside the house without breaking something, that the letters were the overflow, that the furniture was what happened to love when a man didn't have the language for it and had to do something with his hands instead. Then he told her about the account. She had to read that section twice. For 22 years Frank had been selling pieces, not locally, not in ways she would have stumbled across. He'd found a dealer in Providence who specialized in handcrafted furniture, a man named Walter Briggs, who had come to the house once for a delivery and whom Dorothy had vaguely remembered as someone Frank knew from somewhere. Walter had been selling Frank's work to collectors and small galleries along the New England coast. The rocking chairs went for between $800 and $1,200, the writing desks for more. A set of nesting balls had sold to a woman in Newport for $2,000, and she'd commissioned 3 more sets. Frank had never touched the money. He'd put all of it, every sale, into a savings account in Dorothy's name alone. Not a joint account, hers. The account number was written in the letter, along with the name of the bank and the name of the woman at the branch he'd dealt with, a Caroline Marsh, who knew Frank and knew the arrangement, and had his instructions to call Dorothy 6 months after his passing if she hadn't called first. Dorothy looked at the number Frank had written in the margin beside the account information, his estimate of the balance as of the year he'd written the letter. She sat very still for a moment. Then she read it again to make sure she'd understood. $86,000. In an account she hadn't known existed, built from 22 years of quiet evenings in a shed at the back of a yard, one piece at a time, the way you build anything that lasts. He had written, "I know you'll say I should have told you. You're right, I should have told you. I wanted to tell you 100 times, but I was afraid that if I told you, you'd tell me to stop, that we didn't need it, that we were fine. And we were fine, but I wanted you to be more than fine after I was gone. I wanted you to have choices. I wanted you to have room." She folded the letter carefully along its original creases and held it in her lap for a long time. Outside, a bird was working in the apple tree. She could hear the kettle had long since boiled and gone quiet in the house. Frank had known her well enough to know she would have told him to stop. She would have said they were fine. She would have meant it. And she would have been wrong, in the way you can be wrong about something without knowing it. Not dishonestly, but incompletely. The way you don't know what you need until the morning you are standing in a yard with a key in your hand and 14 months of silence behind you. She got up, put the letters back in the tin box, and carried it to the house. Diane was at the kitchen table with 2 cups of tea, long, cold. She looked up when Dorothy came in, and something in Dorothy's face must have told her to wait before speaking. Dorothy set the tin box on the table. She sat down. She told her daughter about the account. Diane listened without interrupting, which cost her something. Dorothy could see it costing her. When Dorothy finished, Diane was quiet for a full minute, looking at the surface of her cold tea. "He did all of that without saying anything," Diane said finally. It wasn't a question. It wasn't quite an accusation either. It was something a daughter says when she's recalibrating who her father was. "That was your father," Dorothy said simply. "But you didn't know." "No." And you're not angry? Dorothy thought about it honestly. She'd been asking herself the same questions since she'd read the account number in Frank's careful handwriting. Angry at a man for spending 22 years building her a safety net she didn't know she had. Angry at a man for filling 40 letters with everything he'd been afraid to say out loud, because the love was too large and he didn't have the words, and so he used wood and linseed oil and dovetail joints instead. No, she said. I know how he was. He was never different with me than he was in those letters. I just didn't have the letters before. Diane reached across the table and covered Dorothy's hand with her own. I called Curtis, Diane said quietly. On the way up. I told him we were putting the assessment on hold. Dorothy looked at her daughter. I shouldn't have pushed, Diane said. I was scared for you. I kept thinking, she's alone. The roof needs work. What if something happens and I'm 3 hours away? But I think I was making it about me, about my being scared, not about what you actually needed. You're not wrong that the roof needs work, Diane almost smiled. The north section. I'll call someone. I'll help you find someone. That was better. That was the right shape for it. Not Diane solving a problem Dorothy hadn't asked her to solve, but the two of them side by side, which was how it had worked when it worked. I want to call that dealer, Dorothy said. Walter Briggs. I want to know what's in the shed, what it's worth. Not to sell the house, just to understand what Frank built. She paused. I want to understand all of it. Walter Briggs drove up from Providence on a Wednesday, a compact and unhurried man in his 70s who moved through the shed with the quiet attention of someone who had been looking at handcrafted work for 50 years. He didn't perform his expertise. He simply looked, touched the joints, held pieces up to the light coming through the window, set them back down. He told Dorothy the rocking chair alone would sell for close to $2,000 in the current market. The writing desk, more. The carved blanket chest, which he turned slowly in the light for a long time before speaking, was something else entirely. The quality of the carving, the precision of the joinery, the choice of wood. He named the figure that made Dorothy set down her coffee cup. Frank knew, Walter said. He always knew which pieces were special. He'd hold them back, said they weren't finished. I think he just couldn't let them go. He looked at the blanket chest. I think he was making things for you and didn't know how to give them to you while he was alive. Dorothy looked at the chest with the carved house on its panel, the apple tree, the woman at the window. He gave them to me this way, she said. Walter nodded, as if that was exactly right. She didn't sell anything that day. She told Walter she would be in touch, and she walked him to his car. And she stood in the driveway for a moment after he left and looked at the house. Her house. The roof with its north section that needed attention. The front steps Frank had repointed 2 summers ago. The window boxes she hadn't planted yet this year. And felt something shift in her chest that had been misaligned for 14 months. She had choices. Frank had made certain she had choices. Not by making decisions for her. Not by telling her what to do with her life, but by quietly and patiently building her the room to decide. That was what the account was. That was what the letters were. That was what the 40 years were. In the evenings now, Dorothy sometimes went out to the shed. She didn't build anything. She wasn't Frank. But she had started cataloging the pieces, photographing them, learning the names of the woods. Cherry and maple and walnut and white oak. She'd found Frank's notebooks on the bottom shelf, 3 composition books filled with measurements and sketches, and the occasional note to himself. Reminders about grain direction and moisture content, and which finish worked on which wood. His handwriting in the notebooks was faster than in the letters, less careful, working handwriting. She liked it. Diane came up twice a month now. They had dinner, walked to the end of Clover Mill Road and back, talked about the teenagers and the hospital, and the north section of the roof, which a contractor named Phil had looked at and declared fixable, not catastrophic. In July, Dorothy called Caroline Marsh at the bank. The balance was higher than Frank's estimate. Interest and a final deposit he'd made 2 weeks before he died, a piece Walter had sold on his behalf, the commission already deducted. Dorothy sat at the kitchen table with the number written on a notepad in front of her and thought about Frank driving to the bank 2 weeks before the end, or making the call from the bedroom, using the voice he'd still had then, doing the last thing he could think of to take care of her. She thought, 40 years. She thought, I knew him and I didn't know him, and somehow both of those things are true, and neither one of them is a tragedy. She put the notepad in the tin box with the letters. She fixed the roof. She planted the window boxes late, zinnias and trailing sweet potato vine, and they came in better than she expected, given the late start. She had Walter up again in September, and they sat in the shed together for 2 hours, and she let him tell her the history of the pieces, what Frank had made and when, and she listened the way you listen when someone is teaching you something about a person you loved. She sold 3 pieces that fall, not the blanket chest, not the cradle, not the rocking chair. 3 smaller things, a pair of wall-mounted shelves and a jewelry box with an interior lined in cedar. And she took the money and put it back into the account that Frank had built for her. Not because she needed to, but because it felt right, because it felt like a conversation. Some evenings she sat in the shed on Frank's work stool with the letters in her lap, not reading them, just holding them. The bulb above the workbench made the same warm light she'd seen from the bedroom window for 25 years. Outside, the apple tree moved in whatever wind was moving, and the yard was quiet, and the house stood behind her the way it had always stood, solid and worn and hers. She had not been waiting, she understood now. She had not been diminished or frozen or preserved in grief. She had been learning, slowly, privately, the way Frank had loved her, that the life she'd thought she was maintaining had always been larger than she'd seen it. That Frank had known her well enough to know she would need to find it herself. That the locked shed and the key on its nail and the 14 months of passing it without reaching for it had been, in their strange and particular way, exactly right. She had opened the door when she was ready. Everything he'd left her had been waiting.